We are in the golden age of Christian apologetics, my friends. One of the most amazing and unexpected features of 2025 has been the number of shows, some of the biggest shows in the world, that are inviting a Christian apologist to lay out a case for Jesus and the Bible. Wes Huff has been on the Joe Rogan Experience, the PBD podcast, Piers Morgan Uncensored, and now Flagrant. So, Wes joined comedian Andrew Schultz and friends on Flagrant, and it was interesting because the four regulars on the show, not sure what they call themselves, the Flagrant Four, maybe, they're smart, and they were making some good points during the discussion. In fact, in this video, I want to talk about something that Andrew Schultz, a comedian, said about the reliability of the Bible, because it's almost always overlooked, and yet it's something Christians and atheists and Muslims need to understand. For context, one of the Flagrant Four, Mark, brought up Bible discrepancies. You read one book of the Bible about some topic, and it says one thing. You read another book of the Bible about the same topic, and it sounds like it's saying something different. What is a Christian to do in this situation?
I have a quick question on the some of the discrepancies that occur in the Bible. That's something that I struggle with sometimes.
Sure.
As a Catholic, we have a little broader, papal authority. But I'm curious, how should Christians deal with discrepancies in the Bible, whether it's like the birth story or like the death of Judas or things like that?
Discrepancies in the Bible. He gave two examples, the birth of Jesus and the death of Judas. So, you read the story about the birth of Jesus in Matthew and the story about the birth of Jesus in Luke, and they're pretty different stories. Then there's the death of Judas. Here we get different stories in Matthew and Acts. How should we deal with these discrepancies? Wes spends a few minutes breaking down how different authors are writing for different purposes and making different points for different audiences. Then he returns to the death of Judas.
A differentiation in detail doesn't necessarily amount to a contradiction. So I haven't found something that I think is an outright contradiction. That's not to say there aren't hard ones. So the death of Judas is a hard one because one gospel says that he went and hung himself in the potter's field. The other says that he falls headlong and his entrails fall out.
According to Matthew 27, Judas feels guilty about betraying Jesus, and he hangs himself. According to Acts 1, Judas falls over and his intestines spill out. Very different accounts. What should Christians do here?
I think it's entirely possible to harmonize that and say he hung himself and the rope snapped and it fell and he it's not, you can see how you could get these kind of things, even if some people think you're playing loose and fast with that kind of thing.
Okay. So you can harmonize the accounts by combining them. Judas hangs himself, maybe on the edge of a cliff, and the rope snaps and he falls headlong and hits some rocks and his intestines spill out. But there are other ways to harmonize these passages.
You also have the fact that in Hebraic Semitic idea, your entrails, like your intestines, are where your credibility comes from.
Got it.
In first century thought, your credibility comes from your intestines. It's similar to how we associate love with the heart. Sometimes we say, so-and-so died of a broken heart. Imagine people in a culture 2,000 years from now, a culture that doesn't associate the heart with emotions, reading about someone in our time dying of a broken heart. They might try to interpret that as a heart attack or something, even though they would be completely wrong. They might not understand our figures of speech. So, what's up with someone's intestines spilling out?
So there could be a play on words in that he could have physically his cut open and his intestines fell out. Yeah. But there also could have been this idea for the Jewish mindset of this is the guy that betrayed Jesus. Of course his entrails fall out because that's where your credibility is.
Wes points out two different ways of harmonizing the accounts. You can say that they both happened, one after the other, or you can say that one of the writers is using figurative language to make a point. Other Christians have proposed additional ways of harmonizing the passages, but at the end of the day, all of these harmonizations are just theories. We don't know exactly what happened. All we know is that we have two different accounts. But here's the issue I wanted to get to, and this is something that Andrew Schultz brings up. Why do we have a discrepancy here at all? Why are there two stories that Christians have been trying to harmonize for centuries? Why didn't the stories line up perfectly from the beginning?
Now, could you argue that there is credibility in the authenticity of the Gospels because they're
Gospels?
The Gospels.
Those are my favorite.
Because me too. It's a cereal. Because there are differing accounts.
Did you catch that? Could the Gospels or Gospitals be more reliable because there are differing accounts?
Like if every account was identical, you don't need 4 accounts.
Yeah.
The fact that they differ slightly and they don't make the changes to make them match up offers more authenticity to me.
The accounts differ, and Christians in the 1st century, the 2nd century, the 3rd century, and so on, don't change them to make them line up perfectly. They leave the stories as they are, and they try to reconcile them in various ways, but they don't change them to make them match.
Because the criticism from the outside is, hey, they're just changing these things to make it look the best so that they can exert power and influence over the people that they rule.
Right.
That's the outside perspective from like an atheist, perhaps. But I'm like, well, okay, well, that's not a really good one if you're putting quote unquote mistakes or differences. You're like, unless they thought it was important to maintain the authenticity of these stories, so they left them in there despite the differences.
Why didn't the Christians just change the stories to make them line up perfectly? Was it because they had so much respect for the texts and so much dedication to preserving the stories accurately that they wouldn't have dreamed of changing them to make them line up perfectly? And if that's the case, don't the differences, in a strange way, support their reliability? Wes ultimately agrees that there would be a problem if the Gospels didn't contain these kinds of differences.
Well, if they all said the same thing, you could accuse them of collaborating in collusion.
Maybe that was a really quick way of saying what I've babbled about.
That's why you brought me on.
Yeah, 100%.
That's good.
Actually, Andrew and Wes were making different but related points, and both points are important. This brings us to another D. Wood jail story. I haven't shared this story much, but when I was first reading the Gospels in jail as an atheist, I had the same reaction that Andrew just had. I saw a discrepancy, and it made me think the Gospels were more reliable, not less reliable. I'll tell you exactly what happened right after a brief word about this video's sponsor. Suppose you're in jail, and you're reading the Bible to refute all the Christians you're enraged at for some reason. As you're reading, you realize that the Bible is far more compelling than you had once thought. You read the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16, and it makes you want to share what you've learned with your family. What do? Easy. Write them a letter and sign them up for an Artza box. What's an Artza box? I'm glad you asked. Artza is a company in Israel that comes up with a new theme every few months. They gather products around that theme from small Jewish and Christian businesses and charities in places like Jerusalem and Nazareth and Bethlehem, and they ship everything in a box. If you sign your family up, they'll get spices, snacks, crafts, decorations, soaps, jewelry, dishes, all kinds of things, straight from the land of the Bible and produced by local artisans who share their products with the world through Artza. But David, if I'm in jail, how can I sign my family up for an Artza box? My goodness, have you seen jails nowadays? My relatives in jail send me emails, so figure it out like you figured out how to get locked up. But David, how can I afford an Artza box in jail? Dude, they're not that expensive. Are you always this slow? No wonder you got caught. Of course, You can order an Artza box for your family even if you're not in jail. You can even order one for yourself. Trust me, you won't regret it. So, whether you're at home or sitting in jail, wallowing in freakish misery, sign up to start receiving Artza boxes. The link is in the description. Be sure to use the promo code DIZZLE to get a discount and to let them know who sent you. Speaking of jail, the year was 1995. If you watched my testimony video, you heard about a Christian named Randy. This was several months before I met Randy. It was one of the times I was in isolation. The only things I had in the cell with me this time were a mattress, a pillow, a blanket, a toothbrush, and a pocket New Testament that a guard handed to me. At first, I used that pocket New Testament to cover my eyes when I was trying to sleep because they kept the light on in my cell. Eventually, I got so bored that I read the Gospel of Matthew. Then I started reading the Gospel of Mark, and I got to the story of Legion in Mark 5. It said that Jesus got out of the boat and met a man with an unclean spirit. The guy was demon-possessed. And I thought, wait a minute. Weren't there two of these guys? Because I had just read the Gospel of Matthew, which had the same story in chapter 8. Except in Matthew, it said that there were two demon-possessed men. Now, these kinds of discrepancies are pretty easy to harmonize. One writer can just be simplifying the story, or if something happens with two people, but one of them is more prominent, like the other guy's there, but he's not doing much, it's easy to see how two writers could tell the same story differently. Think about watching the Flagrant podcast. You and I could both watch the Flagrant podcast and describe it differently. Someone asks me, "What were you watching?" I say, "I was watching Wes Huff." The same person asks you what you were doing. You say, "I was watching Andrew Schultz." That might sound like we were watching two different shows, but we were watching the same show. We were simply describing it differently, depending on what stood out to us most or what we wanted to emphasize. So, not difficult to harmonize something like this. But I wondered, back in 1995, 30 years ago, why was there a difference to begin with? And why didn't Christians just change one of the stories so that they matched? Obviously, these differences don't help show that something is inspired, and they don't prove that the authors were telling the truth. But the differences do cast doubt on two alternative hypotheses, which were mentioned by Wes and Andrew. Wes mentioned collusion.
Well, if they all said the same thing, you could accuse them of collaborating in collusion.
Collaboration and collusion. That's what I believed about the Gospels before I read them. When I was a kid, I thought I figured out how Christianity arose. It was simple. Jesus had followers, then Jesus died. His followers wanted to keep the movement going, so they made up some miracle stories and a story about his resurrection and cranked out some books to spread their new religion. Makes perfect sense, as long as you know absolutely nothing. If you just read the Gospels, this theory doesn't make sense because of the differences. You can explain the origin of the Gospels in a different way, but the idea that some guys got together and conspired to make up what we read in the Gospels doesn't make sense. There's some degree of independence, which means you're dealing with some independent sources. And if you're dealing with some independent sources, you have to figure out why these independent sources agree on so many things. So, collusion was my original theory. Collusion fell apart. That made the Gospels more interesting because there were independent sources of information, not a single source like a group of people conspiring to start a new religion. The other benefit of the differences was brought up by Andrew.
Yeah.
The fact that they differ slightly and they don't make the changes to make them match up offers more authenticity to me.
This is more relevant as a response to a common Muslim view. Lots of Muslims believe that the Gospels were corrupted over the centuries because Christians felt free to make changes. These same Muslims will point to differences as evidence of corruption. But if Christians felt free to make changes, and we know that Christians have always been aware of the differences because they came up with explanations for them, why didn't Christians simply change the stories so that there were no differences? The reason we still have the differences is that Christians didn't feel free to make changes. They wanted to preserve the texts as they were. And even if you get a Christian somewhere who decides to change something, there are copies of the Gospels all over the place. Making a change in Cairo doesn't magically change the copies in Damascus or Athens or Rome. So making the change wouldn't work. To be clear, recognizing this didn't make me believe in the Gospels back in 1995. It simply forced me to rethink my theory about the origin of Christianity. I still believed that people lied in order to invent a new religion. I just thought there had to be multiple liars who weren't always working together, which is why they put out different versions of stories. Eventually, upon further investigation, the liar theory also fell apart. If you'd like to know why the liar hypothesis doesn't work, if you're trying to explain the origin of Christianity, be sure to watch my testimony video and my interview with Sean McDowell.